Phil. This is Veronica. Could you please ask the participants to turn off their microphones while you are speaking, because sometimes there is a background noise from other microphones. So thank you for that.
So,
I mean, if you like, it should be, if you look on the bottom of your screen,
right, there's a
there
mute.
should be a menu bar, and on the left it says mute.
Okay, okay.
Okay. All right, I want to thank you for joining me today for the first part of this three-part workshop, how female investors can take greater control of their finances with less stress. Here's the agenda for today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm offering this workshop. We're going to talk about saving versus investing today, talk a little bit about budgeting, setting priorities, considering both today and tomorrow when you think about all those things. We'll talk about something that's been a lot in the news lately, inflation. And then we'll talk some about credit cards and debt, and that'll wrap it up for this week. If you have any related questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I want this session to be as interactive as possible. In my opinion, also, there's no such thing as a dumb question, because if you don't know the answer, you're never going to find out unless you ask. And I'll answer as best I can. If I don't know the answer, I'll research it and I'll provide an answer next week. And I have 2 more people that I'm supposed to be letting in, so hold on one second. So for those that just joined, this is the agenda for today. As I was saying to everybody, if you have any questions, please ask whatever questions you have. I don't believe there's any such thing as a dumb question, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. So first, I'm going to talk a little about why am I offering this workshop. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal story as to how I ended up here. Because my personal story is really what drives me to help others manage their finances. In my house growing up, there's a lot of uncertainty around finances. My father was the one that was in charge. He did not do a good job. We had, by the time I got my driver's license, I remember having to drive down to the electric company and the phone company to pay bills so that our services would be paid back, would be turned back on. He was a commission salesman, and he didn't save, and he also didn't know how to budget. So it just made things very difficult. And then when my mother was 51, she got diagnosed with breast cancer. And that's when we found out how bad things really were, because my father, he had, at that point in time, rates were probably like 7 to 8%, and he was still paying 15 or 16. And he owed more on the house than they originally paid for it. And right after my mother got diagnosed, they had to move. And at that point, I took over the finances because my mother asked me to try to help, and she ended up passing away 2 years later because her breast cancer metastasized to her brain. And I kind of view the fact that I ended up working with a lot of women in a career that didn't start this way, by the way. I started as a CPA. I worked for Deloitte in public accounting. Then I worked for large companies. Then I got my CFA, which reinforced and developed further my interest and love of investing. That's when I was an analyst. And I realized that I'm still trying to help my mom. So I'm looking for people, I think, that are like my mother that I can help, because she's no longer here for me to help. So I'm trying to help people like I wanted to help her. My goal as an advisor is to take people from point A, where you have a lot of uncertainty about what the future might look like, to point B, where you're more informed about what your retirement can be. That link there, that's a blog that I wrote. It's long. I broke it up into parts when I released it, but it's a long blog. It tells kind of more about my story. But I know firsthand the impact that failing to save and prepare for your financial future can have. It meaningfully impacted my personal and professional life. Sorry, I have one more person to let in. I know it was particularly hard on my mom because she had little control over the finances in our home. And she had actually started a business right as she got a little bit before she got diagnosed. She went back to college and became an occupational therapist. And I think that was all driven in her desire to get out of her situation, but she never got the chance. So then, but why else am I offering this workshop? Like, why else is it focused on women? Well, first of all, financial literacy. Claudia, you and I talked about this a little bit before everybody else joined. Like, our schools don't teach this stuff. My wife and I have 4 kids. They don't really get much in the way of instruction in finance in school. They don't teach it, so we don't know what to do. Financial literacy, it's important to everyone, but it's especially important for women because they live longer. They have weaker earnings power as a general rule. They have bigger gaps in employment because the responsibility for taking care of kids often falls on them. The responsibility for taking care of aging parents can fall on them. So that makes it difficult. In short, women are paid less. They go in and out of the workforce and they live longer. They also have, that leaves them with fewer dollars, but they also have more years of retirement to pay for. So here we can look at life expectancy. We see that as we age, the gap between men and women, it gets smaller. But what's interesting is, I shared this with my son because he and I were having a conversation about it. He said, Dad, that gap gets smaller, but if you look at it in relative terms, it's not what you think. Like if I take an 80-year-old woman, her life expectancy is 90. That means that there's 12.5% more time left in their life. For an 80-year-old man, that's 10.9% longer. That gap was narrower when they were 50, when it was 70.6% longer versus 63.6. I know those are just numbers, but what I'm saying is the numbers that I have here, when you look at them in percentage terms, it just goes on to indicate further that women have, as a general, more life to live than men. And also, women tend to marry men that are younger than they are, about 2 years on average. So the end result of all this is that roughly 90% of women end up on their own at some point, whether that's through divorce, whether it's through the death of a spouse, whether it's because they never got married at all. The average age of a widow is only 59. So this all leads to more years in retirement at a cost. So life expectancy is something that should be factored in when you're thinking about your Social Security claiming strategy, which is something I'm going to discuss in more detail next week. We'll go into some of the things that you want to consider with that because it matters. Because the longer you can wait to take that benefit, the more it can be. So, as I said, it's a second factor in terms of what happens to women is there's a wage gap. Women, on average, earn less than men. They're also saving at far lower rates than men. 60% of women can't come up with emergency savings for something unexpected versus 50% of men. And only 36% of women would be able to meet their basic expenses if they were out of work for an extended period of time versus 45% of men. So that's why it also becomes really important that you invest, because investing can help bridge the gap, because we have this really low interest rate environment in particular. So it's very hard to earn anything on your money, so you lose purchasing power. And on this slide, you see some of the differences that happen from this wage gap, like nearly 7 additional months of premium for employer-based health insurance. That's the difference in that wage gap. More than 6 months of mortgage and utilities payments. That's what that wage gap represents. And there's other examples there, but that wage gap matters because you think about it, it's harder to make to pay those bills and to make ends meet and to save, because like I said, it's really important to just save for the future. And then here we kind of look at the traditional household roles and models, and you can see that different things are split. between men and women. And in the typical household, what you find is that oftentimes the man takes care of finances for a period of years, and the woman does these other things. And what I find is a lot of times as we start to move through life, we get to a point, and when the kids start to get older and there's more questions about things, and so the wife will say to the husband, so we've been saving money for the future. What does that mean? And he has no idea what it means. None at all. He just knows that he's been saving. But there's, women are typically more goal-oriented than men. So men just save, but they don't know what they're saving for. They don't know how to do it. They don't know what happens when they have to pull the money out. And women are just as capable of men of managing the finances. That's really important to know. But many surveys suggest that while men are more financially literate than women, based upon their ability to correctly answer questions that test one's knowledge of concepts such as compound interest, but financial knowledge only tells 2/3 of the story. What's the other piece? Confidence. Financial literacy tests instruct individuals to select a multiple choice response. It typically includes do not know. Many more women select do not know if they're given the opportunity to answer that way than their male counterparts. If you pull that option out, then women are much more likely to select the correct answer. They just lack confidence in a lot of cases, so that they know more than they think they know. So the other thing is the thought processes of men and women are different. So I like to show that, in particular, the bottom of these two images, it's Homer Simpson, and like that's supposed to represent his brain on stocks, right? Like gets so excited that nothing else is there, and all that's there is just that little bit, and you're not really thinking well. In general, women make decisions differently than men. That's why it's important. It should be a team approach. It shouldn't just be one person doing everything. Next week, I'm going to talk about diversity in investments. You also want to recognize diversity among the team members. In general, women are more risk averse than men. They also have better risk adjusted returns. They're also more willing to hold to security long-term rather than trade in and out more frequently. They've also seen, like, when we have a bad market, women are more likely to hold on, and men get really nervous, and that makes them trade. And honestly, holding on for the long term typically is the best answer. So now what I'm going to do, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to give you a little quiz. So let me just pull that up here. You'll see that one of the things I did on this quiz is I pulled out do not know. So you have to answer all the questions. It's all anonymous, so I'm not going to know who got what or anything else. But I'd like you to go through and try to answer, and then to answer the questions, then I'll go over the answers with you. And if you have any questions, you need clarification as you go through, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can send me a question in the chat too. That should also work. Should be just a little bit more. I see that 6 people so far have completed out of 9. All right, I have 7 out of 9, so I'm going to start going over them. And those of you that are still finishing, please go ahead and finish, but I'm going to start answering. So the first question says, suppose you had $100 in a savings account and the interest rate was 1% per year. After 2 much years, how much do you think you would have in the account if you left the money to grow? So the correct answer is the first one. It's more than $102. And this is an example of compound interest. So I know the interest rates are low and it's the magnitude of the numbers makes it small to see, but think of it this way. After 1 year at 1%, you'd have $101. In the second year, now you earn 1% on the $101. So you'd have $1.01 more of interest. So if I add 101 plus 101, I end up with 102.01 because you're getting interest on your interest. And that's why you end up with that answer. On the second question, imagine the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year and inflation was 2% per year. After 1 year, how much would you be able to buy with the amount of money in this account? The answer is less than today, because this goes back to when I mentioned earlier, the idea that we want to make sure that we save. I'm sorry, 2 people, I'm letting 2 people in. That your purchasing power goes down, because here your money is growing at a slower pace than inflation. So therefore, your money buys you less. So you would be able to buy less than today, which is the third answer. The third question, please tell me whether this statement is true or false. Buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. Everybody answered false to this question, and that's correct. And the reason for that is that when you own a stock mutual fund, you own multiple stocks, so that if something really bad happens to one of them, it has less of an impact than if you only own a single stock. That single stock can also give you the greatest potential for return, but if we're thinking about diversification and mitigating risk, to have that mutual fund works to our advantage, because it makes each individual stock within that fund less impactful on our final results, so there's less risk that way. Number 4, suppose you own $1,000 on a loan and the interest rate you're charged is 20% per year compounded annually. If you didn't pay anything off at this interest rate, how many years would it take for the amount you owe to double? So I like to think of something called the rule of 72 to answer a question like this. The rule of 72 says that if you take the interest rate and you divide that number into 72, that gives you an approximation as to how long it takes for something to double. So in this case, if I take 15 into 72, the answer to that is about 5 years. So that means that the answer should be at least 2 years, but less than 5. If the interest rate was 20%, it would be at least 2, but less than 5, but then we would get 3.6 years to double, right? If we had a 10% interest rate, it takes about 10 years to double. So that's a good rule of thumb to figure out how long it takes for something to double. Number 5, suppose you had $100 in a checking account that pays no interest. If you withdrew 5% of what was left in the account each year, how much do you think you would have at the end of 2 years? At the end of that is going to be more than $90, the first choice. And the reason for that is let's work out the numbers. So in the first year, I'm withdrawing 5%. So 5% of 100 is $5. That leaves me with $95. The next year, I'm going to take 5% of $95, which is $475. So if I take 95 less 475, I'm left with $90.25. This is kind of the opposite of how compound interest works, because every year when I take something out of my account, there's a little bit less. So if I'm taking the same exact percentage every year, the amount that I'm going to take falls every year. Number 6, there's a 50% chance that Jay's old car is going to need repair in the next year. That would cost him $800. Also in the next year, there's a 10% chance Jay's going to need to replace the carpeting in his home at a cost of $3,000, which poses the greater expected cost to Jay. The answer is the car repair. And the reason for that, it's kind of like probability or expectations math. So what you do is he said that it was going to cost $800 to fix the car, and there's a 50% chance that it was going to need that repair. So I take the $800 times the 50%. That means the expected cost of that repair is $400. For the carpet, while it's a $3,000 cost, there's only a 10% chance that it's going to happen in his estimation. So in that case, I take the $3,000, I multiply by the 10%, and the expected cost in that case is only $300. So the expected cost of the car repair is $400. The expected cost of replacing the rug is $300. So therefore, the car repair has a higher expected cost. Number 7, which statement is true? Alex has a low credit score. Everybody got this right. This means he has a history of late payments and carrying balances on his credit cards. The lower your credit score is, the worse your credit report reflects on your credit. So that means that you're gonna you've made late payments, you're carrying balance, because one of the other factors, and we'll talk about this a little bit later today, but one of the other factors in determining your credit score is what percentage of your available credit are you using. So he's making late payments and carrying balances. So therefore that hurts his credit score. Number 8, Jane is a retired worker. Which statement is correct about Jane's Social Security? Jane's monthly Social Security benefits will be the same no matter how old she is when she starts to receive them. That's not true. We can start collecting Social Security as early as age 62 and as late as age 70. And the longer we wait, typically the higher our benefit becomes. Social Security is going to pay Jane a benefit sufficient to maintain her pre-retirement living standard. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen. You know, your benefit is based upon, you have to contribute to Social Security a minimum of 10 years or 40 quarters. And they take your highest 35 earning years out of your career. And then that's how they determine your benefit, but there's no guarantee that that's going to allow you to maintain your standard of living. In fact, it's likely that you're going to make less than from Social Security benefits than you did when you were working. Social Security will pay a benefit to Jane until she dies. That's the correct answer. You do get a benefit until you die. Number 9, Bill and Mary own a house which they would like to sell to move to a smaller place. Which statement about selling the house is correct? The correct answer is C. When Bill and Mary sell their house, they receive the price they sell their house for minus their outstanding mortgage and other expenses associated with selling the house. You don't have to pay off your existing mortgage before you can put your old house on the market. You may have to pay it off to get a new mortgage, but you don't have to pay it off to put your house on the market, because in fact what happens is you get the net difference between the value of your house, your selling price and your mortgage balance. That balance goes paid, the balance of you gets paid back to the bank because they get paid first. They have the primary lien on your property, so they're the first ones to be paid. And then our last question, suppose Ann purchases an appliance that retails for $1,000 with equal monthly payments of $100 per month for 12 months. The total payments Ann made by year's end total $1,200. What's the interest rate that Ann paid for this purchase? The correct answer to this one is going to be more than 20%. Ann paid $200 in interest over the course of this year, and she didn't fully repay the balance because she paid $100 a month for 12 months. That's $1,200 in payments. So that's $200 of interest. And she didn't fully repay the balance. So she paid, we know that 200 over 1,000 would be 20%. And since the balance isn't paid, we know that the interest rate was more than 20%. So that's it for the quiz. I'm going to take it off the screen. And then before I move on, does anybody have any other questions? I do see one in the chat. Somebody said, can I repeat the rule of 72 again? So certainly. So that rule says that usually I think of it in an investing context. How long is it going to take for my money to double at a different return? So I take the growth rate that I'm assuming and I divide it into 72. And that tells me about how long it takes. So like if I expect my investments to grow at 10% a year, I take that 10%, I divide it into 72, and that comes out to 7.2, it's about 7. So that means at a 10% interest rate, my money doubles in about 7 years. If it was a 2% interest rate, I divide 2 into 72, my money takes 36 years to double. At a 5% rate, I take 5 into 72, and that tells me that it's about 15 years for my investment to double. On the other hand, if it was 15% a year, I would divide 15 into 72, and that would tell me it takes 5 years for my investment to double. So that's a good rule of thumb to use when you're trying to find out what kind of growth rate do you need for your money to double in X number of years.
Phil, I have a quick question. This is Veronica.
Sure,
So the rule of 72, you can use the calculation both to determine how long it takes you to pay off a balance at specific interest rate, and also how much your investment will grow based on
it's
so
not, it's how long it'll take your investment to double.
double.
So
Okay.
like if
can
I
you-
invested $1,000,
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
if I invested
$1,000.
$1,000 and I earned 10% per year, it would take 7 years to get it to 2. Yeah, it's roughly, it's not meant to be exact.
Right, no, that's fine.
Yep. So that's
Okay,
the side. Okay.
yeah, okay, great, thank you.
You're very welcome.
I have a question too, quick.
Sure.
So if you were looking at the interest rate being compounded monthly instead of yearly, would the same thing work?
In generally it does, but I would just take that month, that rate and associate with 12 months.
Okay,
It's not meant to be, so if it was compounding at 0.5% per month, I would say, okay, that's 6% per year, and it's going to take 12 years to double. I mean, the more frequently the compounding happens, that does have it, if we're trying to get precise, that has an impact. But for purposes of this general rough approximation, it doesn't really matter that much. But I would always just put it on an annual basis instead of looking at it on a monthly basis.
okay.
Okay. Now that we're going to start to talk about saving versus investing and the key differences. So first of all, why do we save? We want to put our money to work. I remember back when I was in college and I had switched my major. I started college, I was a pre-med and a psychology major, and I became an accounting major at the end. And I was taking an accounting class and I had an interest in investing back then. And I wanted to take a course it was called portfolio theory. And the economics department and the business school didn't like each other at the school. And that course was only offered in the economics department, so I couldn't take it. And I went to my professor that was teaching me a finance class. I said, this isn't right. Here I am in school. I'm trying to get a job that's going to help me earn money. And when I'm done, I want to be able to put my money to work so that it can earn more money for me. And the school won't let me take it. And I just don't think that's right. And he actually responded in a very nice way. He said, you're right. And he gave me an independent study so that I was able to do what I wanted. But the key thing here is investing and saving allows us to live a better quality of life now and in the future. Whenever I talk to people about retirement and financial plans, one of the things that we always talk about is, what's the quality of life that you want to live in retirement? Most people say, I want to live similarly to how I did while I was working. Well, how do we do that? We have to make sure that we save along the way. Investing versus saving also helps protect us from inflation. But they're not the same thing. If you want safety, there's nothing safe, savings accounts are going to be much safer. You can put money in the bank and it up to $250,000 of the money you put in your bank account is insured. And you invest in a stock, your entire investment's at risk. On the other hand, you're not going to get the same kind of growth. Like if we put money in the bank today, the interest rate is nominal. A lot of accounts I see, it's 0.01%. I can go online and use an online bank and get maybe 0.5%, but that's about it. So you really don't earn very much. Your potential from investing is much greater. Your principal barely grows when you put money into a bank account or even a bond. Peter Lynch was a very successful investor, and he told this story, like, why do I invest in stocks? He said, look, I can buy a bond. If I buy a bond for $1,000 today, and it's a 10-year bond, I'm going to get at the end of 10 years, and as long as the company is still solvent, I'm going to get my $1,000 back, and I'm going to earn whatever percent interest along the way. And that's all I'm going to get. On the other hand, if I invest in a stock, my hope is that I put that same $1,000 into a stock, and at the end of 10 years, if we go back to my rule of 72, if it grew at 7% a year, my $1,000 is $2,000. And if that stock paid a dividend, I get to earn those dividends during the time that I own it. And oftentimes when companies pay dividends, they increase them over time. So I have the ability to grow my principal and my income over time with a stock. I can't do that with a bond. The stock market can potentially deliver higher returns, but you also have the risk of loss. That's why we diversify, which like I said, I'm going to talk more about that next time. And if we just look at the S&P 500, which is the primary broad-based index that people look at for stock market performance. In 2008, when we had the financial crisis, the S&P 500 lost 37%. In 2013, it rose 32%. We've had 3 good years in a row. 2019, it was up 31.5. 2020, it was up 16%. Last year, it was up about 27%. The year before that, it lost 4% in 2018. And as of yesterday's close, the S&P is down 5.3% so far this year. So we don't know for sure what's going to happen. Also, when you think about investing, especially in stocks, you want to consider total returns. What I mean by that is you want to consider the growth in your investment as well as the income you receive. I like to look at it sometimes. If I buy a stock that might be flattish, but is paying me a dividend, I'm paid to wait while and then over the longer term, I expect that stock to go up. But in the meantime, it's paying me a nice stream of income. So like one thing that I do right now is I do look to tilt investment portfolios a little bit more towards dividend producing stocks because it's so hard to get income from bonds. But I do know that I want to be careful, that I don't want to just avoid bonds because of the fact that they do provide diversification benefits, because the fact that they don't always move in sync. And so we want to have things in our portfolio to balance out. Talk budgeting a little bit. So why do we budget? Well, budget helps you plan how much you're going to spend and save each month. It can also let you track your spending habits. So I think back to, I remember when I bought my first house and I wasn't sure that I could afford it. I remember this, I got a piece of paper that I would take with me everywhere that I went. And anytime I spent any money on anything, even if it was a quarter, I wrote it down because I was that particular. I want to know everything that I was spending. And I kept track of that for a month or two. I put it into a spreadsheet and I looked and said, okay, I know I can afford to buy this house because here's all the things that I'm spending money on that I could stop spending if things got tight, right? Oftentimes when I talk to people about budgeting now, the software that I use for financial plans does help in terms of what you're spending money on, but I also say, pull out your credit card bills. Many of us have these expenses that we're paying every month. We don't even realize we're paying them anymore. And some of them are for things we don't even need. Like I know I remember reading a survey, one guy that talked about this and he said, this was during the pandemic when he wasn't flying and he was still paying for his Wi-Fi service on airplanes and he didn't even realize it till he looked at his bill. When we budget, we want to understand what we earn, which is our income, and what we spend, which are our expenses. And we want to think about 2 different buckets of expenses. One is kind of our fixed expenses, and that would be like our mortgage payment, to a certain extent, our utilities, to a certain extent, what we're spending on our car because we need it to work, versus our variable expenses, the ones that we have more control over. And those are things like how often we go out to eat, and when and where and how much we spend when we go on vacation and those things. So you want to make sure that you separate those 2 out because one of those is more controllable than the others. Also, you want to think about preparing for big expenses. You want to think about vacations, have an emergency fund, which is really going to be 3 to 6 months worth of spending, holiday spending, and home improvements. There are tools that you can use to track your income. You don't have to use that little piece of paper like I said I did, but you can use personal finance tools like Quicken, Mint. It's in my financial planning software, which is Right Capital. It'll help you do that. They have an app too. There's also Honeydew Personal Capital. So you want to think about your fixed costs versus your variable costs. and try tracking your expenses for 30 days or 60 days, whatever it is. It can be really an eye-opening experience when you see what you're spending your money on and realize, hey, if things are tough, this is what I could cut out, or here's where I'm wasting my money. Before I go on for this, I do see in the chat that I got a question about where does the money for the dividend come from? So that relates to stock investing. So I'm going to go back to that for a second. So when you invest and buy stock, you own a piece of the company. Each share represents an ownership interest in the company. If a company had 1 million shares and you had 100, you own 100 over 1,000,000% of that company. That company earns money from its operations. And then the company has to decide what to do with those earnings. If the company's growing, they're likely going to reinvest that money into future growth opportunities. If they're more mature and they have excess cash, they're going to look to return that money to shareholders. So one of the ways that they do that is they pay dividends, so that they pay the dividends out to their shareholders, their distributions paid on a per share basis to all the shareholders. It's not really, you own shares of the company, but you don't have control of the money. Manager of the company decides how to deploy the capital that they have. So it's the management's decision as to how to pay, if, when, and how to pay that money out. So that's where the dividends come from. They come from the company's earnings. When you're making a personal budget, some things to think about is a general framework. You can use the 50-30-20 rule. What I mean by that is 50% of your income goes towards your needs, 30% towards your wants, and 20% for savings and debt repayment. That's a nice rule of thumb to use when you're trying to figure out how to allocate your money. Automate what you can, and that especially applies to payment, to savings. I think of it as paying yourself first. Like if you have a 401k at work and they take that money out of your paycheck every pay period, you never see the money, you've paid yourself first, and it's not there for you to spend. And you get used to it not being there, so you don't think about it when you're deciding what you can spend your money on. And if you have additional ability to save, you can take other accounts and do the same thing with as you do with your 401k or your 403b or whatever type of retirement plan you have. You can think about how much can I have taken out of my paycheck and directed to some type of savings account. When you have a budget, you want to make sure you track your progress, and remember that periodically you want to revisit it. You know, or your income, expenses, and your priorities, all those things are going to change over time. So you want to go back and look at them over time and make sure that nothing's changed. Like I talk to people about when we do a financial plan, here's kind of the things that we want to do. Are we doing those? Are we not doing those? And what's changed? Right? Is your spending changed? Have your goals changed? All those things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But we want to make sure that it reflects our current thinking. And if there's been any changes, maybe we moved, maybe we got a new job. I mean, all those things can impact our budget. It's important when you think about a budget or your financial plan, either one, to set priorities. What matters most to you? Does your spending reflect what you say matters to you? And then it can be really hard to prioritize. So like when I think about prioritizing, when I work with people, I ask a series of life planning questions. The first question is really very broad. It talks about designing your life. Like, what would your ideal life look like? What does it include? You know, what would you do with your money? You know, is there anything you would do now that you're changing? It's to describe a complete life. The second question gets a little bit tougher because now you have less time. So if you had less time left to live, what were you going to do with that time? And will you change your life? And if so, how will you do it? And then the last one is, and you go to the doctor and you find out, you know, you have only days to live. What did you miss? What do you wish you'd done? And so like, when I go through that exercise, I always find it interesting. Sometimes people are very, very consistent as I go through. And sometimes when I get to the third question, There's things that they didn't talk about as much at the beginning that we realize are important, but they just didn't think of. So to me, it's a really good exercise because I like to get to know my clients and understand what is important and what matters to them. And, you can go through these exercises yourself. The father of life planning, his name is George Kinder, and you can buy his book on the topic where he goes into it in pretty good detail. And the hardest thing that I often talk about with people is how do we balance spending among the experiences we want to have today versus providing for our kids' future or our grandkids, depending upon where we are in life, and saving for retirement or living our life in retirement, right? There's a lot of different things that we want to balance, that we have to balance against. It's like one of the things I do tell people when they're thinking through that too is when we get to retirement, it's a lot harder to borrow money. Like if you're thinking about funding certain things, it, especially like one that comes up because of the cost is college, right? If you're trying to fund college, borrowing now is probably easier than taking money out of your retirement savings to pay for it and then putting yourself behind the eight ball when you come to retirement. As we do all these things, we want to consider today and tomorrow. Like some of the really important questions you want to think through as you're trying to figure all this out is, what do you want? When do you want to stop working? What do you want to do when you retire? Where do you want to live? How much is it going to cost? Right? And where you live matters too, because there's difference in state taxes. That's why so many people end up in Florida. Two reasons. One is the weather, right? But the other reason is Florida doesn't have state income tax. So it can save a lot of money. And I know I have a client that we did a plan and they're in California and we're going to move to Washington. And then they said, well, maybe I'm not. Well, in Washington state, there's no state income tax. In California, there's a very high tax rate. So that change has a big impact on the financial plan. Are your retirement plans compatible with your spouse or partner? What items are on your bucket list of things that you really want to do in retirement? Another question a lot of people wonder about and think about is, when you get to 70 or whenever retirement is, are you still going to be paying your mortgage, or do you want to have it all paid off beyond that? I mean, I know interest rates are low, but there's still a comfort level that comes with not having a mortgage payment that has people take greater efforts to make sure that it's paid, because then that's an expense that goes away in retirement. And then also a big one is, what matters more, things or experiences, which matter more to you? All right, now we're going to talk some about inflation. In short, inflation is a decrease in a currency's purchasing power. The same amount of money buys you less. And so I have a little picture here, a cup of coffee in 1970 cost a quarter. Because of inflation in 2019, which is when this graph was from, that same cup of coffee would be $1.59. So that means it costs more than 6 times as much for that cup of coffee over the period of 49 years. And that's a perfect example of inflation, because that quarter doesn't buy you the same thing now that it did back then. Inflation really represents spending power. It's the rate at which the price of goods and services increase over time. Ideally, we want to maintain our standard of living. $200 today doesn't equal $200 tomorrow. That's why there's an old thing like, would you rather have $100 today or $100 a year from today? It's always better to take, if the amounts are the same, you want the money today, because of the fact that it's worth more today than it is in the future. We can see inflation in 2 ways. One is higher prices, we pay more for stuff. The other way that I think we see a lot of inflation now is what I refer to as shrinkage. By that, the packet size shrinks. You may not realize the price increase. Like, think about ice cream. I remember used to buy ice cream, it was a 64-ounce container. Now it's 48 for that same container, and it costs more. Right? So, and there's lots of things, like I know the orange juice, it used to be 64 ounces. Now I think it's like 59. Paper products, I think that you get less sheets per roll of toilet paper, all these things. You get less quantity, and you may not realize that part of the inflation. You might see the prices gone up, but you don't realize you're also getting less as easily. If wages increase at a slower rate than prices, you're still falling victim to inflation. Your spending power declines. So like in the fourth quarter, they said that inflation was 7%, which is the highest in 40 years. And wage growth was up too, but wage growth didn't keep pace with inflation. So that meant even though your wages grew, you still had less buying power because prices were increasing faster than your income was. Women have a longer life expectancy. Because of that, inflation matters even more. At the end of the day, nobody wants to eat cat food when we're older. I don't know why, but it seems like whenever somebody mentions that, it's always cat food. Nobody says dog food. They always say cat food. And I'm not sure why. As our currency loses value, prices rise. That means it buys fewer goods and services. And when the government reports inflation numbers, the two most common indexes are the consumer price index and the wholesale price index. Sometimes those numbers can be a little bit misleading because they use a substitution effect. So if beef prices went up more than poultry prices, they might say, well, you're just going to buy more poultry and less beef. So they'll assume that you substitute, and then they'll factor that in, and inflation might be understated because of that. So that the numbers that we see may not always be what they are. That are reported may not always be what we see, I guess is a better way to say that. So what are some of the effects of inflation? Over time, as prices go up, money loses value. For instance, if you kept the dollar under your pillow for 10 years, it's not going to buy as much as it could today. Go back to like the little graph of the coffee cup price, of a cup of coffee prices being an example. As inflation increases, consumers are incentivized to buy now rather than pay more next year. As money starts losing its value under inflation, it's necessary to beat inflation just in order to maintain the same purchasing power, which gets back to why it's important to make sure that you invest. Even though there's a little bit more risk, it's still better to invest than just put your money into the bank. Historically, asset prices increase more rapidly than inflation. For example, if we consider long-term house prices, an average house sold in the US in 1980 went for $74,500. Adjusted for inflation, that's $231,000 in 2019 prices. At the same time, though, the average house today now sells for $375,000, which means that that's increased by $144,000 over the 40-year period. If you take out a mortgage, remember you pay back that plus interest. If you had a 25-year, 5% loan, the total cost with interest over 25 years is going to be $345,000. That means you're paying $145,000 in interest costs alone. But if we consider inflation, you really only paid $205,000, so that it really wasn't borrowing that money to help pay off the house made sense because of the fact that the interest rate you paid on the loan was basically in line with inflation. As the price of goods increase, it goes without saying that consumers have to pay more in order to buy basic necessities and luxuries alike. So what does this mean? It means that it's important to invest. Why? If interest rates don't keep pace with inflation, as I said, our purchasing power goes down over time. Interest rates are less than the rate of inflation. You want to protect your purchasing power. If your money sits in cash, your purchasing power declines. You won't be able to buy as much with your money. Investing provides us with our most reasonable chance to keep pace with inflation, or maybe even beat it. Investments can go at a pace that's equal to or greater than inflation. The interest we earn on our cash is unlikely to keep pace with inflation. Consider the current environment. We had 7% inflation in the fourth quarter. A bank account paid just above zero. That means your money buys less. Let's talk some about credit cards and debt. So your credit card score is used for a lot of things. Some of them we don't always realize. Certainly used to help determine the interest rate when you buy a car or a house. Sometimes it could be involved if you're trying to land or keep a job. If you're applying for a new credit card or another personal loan, your credit score matters. If you're trying to refinance a loan, your credit score matters. When you set up a utility account, they look at that. If you rent an apartment, they look at that. I know I had a woman that I worked with, and her husband really badly mistreated her. And before they got divorced, he stopped paying on her credit cards. And so when she went to move out, she couldn't get rent. She had to get somebody in the family, in her family. Fortunately, she had somebody that could help her to help her pay a year's worth of rent ahead, because that was the only way that she could move out of what was a really bad situation, because he made her credit rating so bad, she couldn't rent an apartment. They look at your credit card. If you get a cell phone, it also can matter when you're getting insurance, because they want to make sure that you're going to be able to pay it. What affects your credit card history? I mean, your credit card score, your payment history, number one, your credit usage. So if you have credit cards, for example, you have $50,000 worth of credit cards. If you have $20,000 outstanding, your utilization is high, because that's 40%, the 20 over the 50, versus if you had 10,000 outstanding, that would be only a 20% utilization. They like to see your utilization be lower. The length of your credit history matters. The credit mix matters in terms of like what kind of accounts do you have, what interest rates, and then also how many recent applications you filed. You can take steps to improve your credit score. You should certainly look to get usage down. Sometimes it can help to get another card if you're good with your cards. It can help to get another one just to increase your score. Or if your income's gone up, you can tell your credit card company that I have higher income and see if they'll make your credit line a little bit bigger. Even if you don't use it, it just helps your score because it lowers your utilization. You want to make sure you make on-time payments. You want to check your credit report. So you can get free credit reports regularly in a lot of different ways. I use Credit Karma. They send me an email every month. Also, many of the banks that you have credit cards with, they now give you access to free credit card reports. So I know I check mine every month just to make sure, and I'm not checking it so much to see where my score is unless there's a massive change, because I want to, it's a good way to check to make sure that there's not any fraud committed against you. If you know that you're doing a good job, your score shouldn't change a lot. So you want to just keep an eye on what your score is to make sure that it's okay. So these are the topics that we cover.
I have a quick question
Sure.
about the score on your credit. I know when sometimes we are applying, let's say, for refinancing or anything dealing with credit, the companies, or even if you're applying to rent an apartment, companies are doing a credit check. Can you talk or explain what does the credit check do to your credit score, and also soft versus hard credit check? If you have that information available, how does that affect your credit score?
So basically, if they look too many times, that can have a negative effect on your credit score. But all those, when you want to get a loan, they do get a credit report, because they want to see if I want to refinance my house, or if I want to buy a house, I want to know what kind of rate I'm going to pay. And the only way that they can answer that is to look at your credit report, your credit score. So they're going to look. Soft versus hard depends on if it's just like they're looking at it, but you haven't applied for anything yet, versus when you have. Right. So if I apply for a loan or I apply for a card, that's hard, versus soft is they're just kind of looking, but you're not applying for anything with it. And credit card scores at the high end are 850. When I talk to people about credit card scores, they tell me credit scores, not credit card, but credit scores, anything over 750. The difference between 750 and 800 really shouldn't matter that much, because I know the last time I applied, I asked that question, and it was to refinance the house. And I was told as long as you're over 750, they don't really work beyond that, because there's just a little bit of nuances that go from 750 up.
So just to follow on her question,
Mhm.
I know that in the past, when I've applied for refinancing or something like that, they said, um, well, you've had too many credit cards or too many credit checks. And so that lowered my score, that lowered the probability that that the bank would want to give me a loan.
I love you.
Yeah, I mean, that, Valerie, that can have an impact. It should be less than those other things that we talked about, but it still can, because it's just, they're worried, like, if you applied for 5 credit cards all at once, right, you might not get all 5 at once. So they want to keep an eye on that, because they don't want to extend you too much credit, because that's really the risk, right, from the financial institution's perspective. They're trying to protect themselves, and different kinds of debt matters different. Like your mortgage is different than your credit card, right? Because your mortgage is secured by your house, right? You get a car loan, it's secured by your car. When I have a credit card, that's unsecured credit. So that's the one that they're most worried about. Like if you were to go out there and just try to open up 5 or 6 at once, that would be a concern. So here's the topics that we reviewed today. We talked about why I'm offering the workshop, saving versus investing. We talked about budgeting. We talked about setting priorities. We talked about making sure you take today and tomorrow into consideration when you're making financial decisions. And we talked about inflation and then credit cards and debt. So the question about, is there a benefit if your score is over 800? From what I've been told, no. 750 is like the benchmark that they look for. Whether or not it's possible that 800 could make a difference, but when I asked the people that are making the decisions, I was told that 750 is kind of considered as the gold standard. Next week, we'll talk about Social Security benefits. I'll talk about different types of investments, the stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and exchange traded funds or ETFs. We'll look at investment returns, diversification, our single biggest expense, and some estate planning considerations. And especially, if you are a single or divorced woman, you want to make sure that you make estate planning related decisions now instead of leave your state to decide for you. So you want to make sure that you put those things into writing. And then I'm open to any other questions. And I'd also love to know, like, if you don't mind, anybody would like to tell me, what are you trying to get at? What made you decide to attend this workshop? What's the things what are you trying to get out of it? Because I want to make sure that those are things that I address sometime between either already addressed today or addressed in the next couple of weeks, as well as any other questions that you might have.
I just have a question about the credit cards while we were just talking about that. Is it important to have them and use them? I've heard that, you can't really build up good credit unless you're using credit cards, and I'm just paying mine off finally after a very long time of having a lot of credit card debt. And I just feel like right now I'm like, I never want to have one ever again, which probably isn't wise, but how important is it to have them and use them?
It's generally viewed as being important. Like I know with my kids, I want them to get to start building up a history, because that matters when they want to buy, if they want to buy a house, if they want to buy a car and they need a loan. Just try to treat them, once they're paid off. Like I went through this, right? When I talked before about my history. So when I was in college, I paid for my tuition and rent. Whatever I didn't have, I put on credit cards. And I ended, back then, this was 1987, they still showed on your statement at the end of the year, because it was right as they were transitioning away from where you got a tax break for credit card interest. I looked at it, showed how much interest I paid, and I knew what I was making. And I looked at these 2 numbers and said, I can't do that. that's just, I don't make enough to pay that much in interest. So I put in place a plan to make my credit card debt go away, and I did. And when I did that, I said, I'm going to target, my view was I'm going to target the highest balance, make it go away. The highest interest rate, the highest interest rate, make that go away. Then once that goes away, things like buying gas and stuff like that, which, it's hard to buy. Like you almost have to have credit cards to a certain extent today, because it's hard. You want to go buy, if you want to buy gas, it means you have to go into the store, and sometimes they're not working. It's easier to just pay right at the pump, but take your credit card and use it just as if, almost like it's a debit card. But credit cards are better than debit cards because credit cards offer you more protection. Because a debit card's tied right to your bank account. You don't have the same fraud protection with a debit card as you do with a credit card. But try and treat that credit card as just a bill that I'm going to pay every month. Don't put on it anything you can't pay. That allows you to build your credit score up, right? Because you make on-time payments. You don't carry balances. You're not using a lot of your available credit. And when you try to get a mortgage or something like that, it'll help you. I think it's really hard to exist in our society today without having some type of credit card debt, credit card usage.
Well, just to answer your question, I'm really interested in the investment side. So when I retire, my mortgage will be paid off, and I developed a habit of making sure that the credit cards will be paid off. But like you said, when you retire, you want to make sure that your living is somewhat close to how it was when you were actually earning salary. And so right now, I just have what is equivalent to a 401k, a 403b that works the same way. Where I'm lacking is what can I be doing on my own for investing?
And so we'll talk about the different investment types, as well as some of the different types of accounts to use, and some of the advantages and disadvantages, and the importance of having diversification of account types as well as investments themselves. So that'll be something, we'll discuss that more next week. And then if there's questions that go beyond what I've covered, you're welcome to ask.
Will we also be talking about socially responsible investing? So, I would prefer to invest in something that is not fossil fuel based. And things like that. So, when you do mutual funds or things like that, how much choice do you have?
We can talk some about that. I'll tell you that it's very frustrating because there's not good standards, and picking funds that meet those investment objectives can be very difficult. Doesn't mean that we can't, but it's just not as easy as you'd like, because there's just not a set of uniform standards. But we can talk more about that, because there are definitely people, and I know you and I have talked about that, Valerie. I know that there are people who are interested in those type of things. So I will make sure to address that. And again, if I don't address your specific questions, I'll be happy to take them separately.
Thanks.
Anything else? So if we don't, I'm not going to just keep you, obviously. I will send out a link that you can use if you would like to view the recording of today's session. I'll also send out the slides, and that'll all be, it usually goes, I try to put it on YouTube and Dropbox so that you can go to either one of those places to get what you need. Yes, Sonia?
Hi, Philip. One of my questions that I would like to touch on during these things is paying off my student loans while I'm still trying to invest for retirement. Because I decided in my late 40s I needed to have 2 master's degrees. Which wasn't a smart idea, I don't think, but anyway.
Okay.
That's one of my big problems.
Okay. All right, again, if I don't cover that, I don't cover specific questions, I'm happy to make sure that I address. You can ask separately if I don't cover exactly what you're looking for on that assignment, but I'll
Okay,
sure that I touch on it at least.
all right, thank you, Phil.
You're welcome.
Are there any budgeting tools that you recommend that are like apps or, I've tried to do this before where I just go through my bank account and look at what I'm spending on and I guess it's more of like a behavior change thing than anything else, but I wonder if there are apps out there that you might recommend.
So I use Mint. I use Quicken. There's also Mint. And one of the ones that I have not used, but I've heard about is called Honeydew. It's Honey, D-U-E. It's spelled that way. And then there's also Right Capital, which is the financial planning software that I use, also comes with a personal spending app. And so like the nice thing about those is you can link your accounts and then they will track the spending out of your bank accounts and credit cards for you. The one thing I have found is they're not always great at categorizing everything. So you may need to go in and do that, but those are all good tools and they're listed on one of the slides. So when you get the slides, I can see if I can find it. Oh, it's in my notes. It's not in the slide itself. So I'll make sure that I'll make sure that I mention those again. But it's Mint, Quicken, like I said, Right Capital, and Honeydew all have apps that you can use to help track your expenses. Okay. And I see about 529 accounts. So those will all go under the account type. So I can touch on those as well. We can talk a little bit on buying silver and gold. I will talk more about Social Security next week. I see that's one. And then, we'll talk about where and how to invest. We can talk more about that. And again, if I don't get into the specifics, I'll be happy to address any questions that you have. And if you're more comfortable one-on-one, we can also set up a call one-on-one to go over any questions you have as well.
Okay, Phil, this is Claudia, just quickly, I'm at that point where when I need to move money to have that emergency fund available, is there anything besides a bank account that, a savings account to put it in? Should I try to get cash for 6 months or a year, or what's been your experience? Now I'm 68 and I have done a major life change. So I've moved from South Carolina to Denver because life is too short and my son is here. And so I was just kind of trying to get a feeling of, maybe we could address some of that. I'm not working and I really didn't want to go back to work, but, I may do it.
So the first question, where to put your money? If you want it safe, emergency funds, I typically recommend putting them in the bank account, but use an online bank. Don't use the one down the street. If you go to, all of a sudden it went out of my mind. It's the place I always go to too.
Bankrate? No.
Yes, Bankrate. Thank you, Bankrate. I go to Bankrate, bankrate.com, and it's not worth it to get a CD or anything because there's just not enough spread on the rates.
Right.
At least at Bankrate, you can find, last time I looked, rates were like 0.4 to 0.5%, but that's still better than your bank, like your brick and mortar bank.
Right.
And you can link those accounts to your checking account so that you can move the money if you need to.
Okay.
Because those emergency funds, you want to make sure that they're safe, because if you have that unforeseen expense come up, you don't want to see that the money that you had is now worth less than what you thought, and now you're still behind the 8 ball. So like that's what I typically recommend for that. And you can go short-term bonds, but still interest rates are so low that there's not much benefit from those either. So that's what I typically do. I mean, if you have, the only thing that it's not as accessible, but there is something called an I bond.
Right. But you have to
You can
take
put
it-
10,000 into
Yeah.
that.
and 7%, right?
Yep, it's 7% till it resets in May, I believe.
No, I knew about those, but I can't lock it in. I'm kind of unsettled at this point.
Yep.
So, anyway, okay, good. Good.
Yep.
Thank you. That does help, though. I need to get back on Bankrate. Now I have some money, some cash in a money market in from some stocks that I sold. Is it better just to leave the cash there or go ahead and move it into a bank? I mean, it's not making any interest there either.
Yeah, it's not. So that online bank is still going to pay a little bit better.
Okay.
And, in terms of duration, I mean, I typically think of 3 to 6 months. I don't necessarily think of longer, but what I will say that if you're not working, like you think of this bucket approach.
Mm-hmm.
I say, what are my expenses? Like, here's what I know my income is, like Social Security, pension, whatever else I have coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what my expenses are. And I look at that difference and say, I want to have money. In this case, I'm going to go out 18 to 24 months longer, where I want to be safe, because that way, if we have a market downturn, I don't have to sell assets at depressed prices, because historically markets have come back in 18 to 24 months.
Right.
And so that I can draw on that, and it's a bucket strategy. I can draw from that bucket during a bad market, and then hopefully the market comes back, and then I can sell assets at higher prices to replenish my bucket.
Okay.
Phil, can you talk more next time about the bucket theory?
Sure.
With some concrete examples, because I read about the bucket theory and I do not know how to apply it. For me, I understand the concept better when I see it in numbers.
Okay.
So if you can make a simple example, that would help me.
Okay. Sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'll put it written, because like I can give you one off the top of my head, but it may be harder to follow than if I put it on the slide.
And I have a meeting at 1 o'clock. I have to at work. I work from home, so I'll have to get ready for that. So I cannot focus now much more.
Okay.
But
Gotcha.
thank you for the presentation.
Oh, you're very welcome. All right, anybody else have questions for today?
I did want to ask real quick, and if we,
Sure.
the I bonds you were just talking about, I believe for 7%, you said it's not as accessible. Exactly what are the penalties or timeframes, or how does that work exactly?
So I'm not going to, I've read it. I know I don't have the specific exact. Right?
Okay,
You can put $10,000 into an I bond. And you could put another $10,000 if you have a tax refund. They let you put $10,000 of your tax refund in it as well. Okay. That's per year, per taxpayer. The current interest rate is 7.12%. It resets every 6 months. If you don't keep your money in for, like, I think if you pull your money out within a year, you lose your interest. If you pull it out after that, you get penalized for a certain amount of time, and then eventually you would get your maximum rate.
Okay.
I don't remember I can look, because like I said, I know I've read about this. I just don't remember exactly where the demarcation lines are in terms of how the penalties work. But I'll look and see if I can find something. I can briefly talk about that next week also.
Okay.
You know, and so certainly in this environment, it's an attractive interest rate. There's no guarantees what it's going to be next time, but I still suspect that it's going to be higher than whatever you could get anywhere else. You know, the biggest disadvantage is because of those penalties that you have, it might not be as liquid, right? Meaning you can't get to it as easily, but after a certain point, even with those penalties, it still can make it more attractive than just putting in the bank, because even after the penalty, you know, that rate will still be better than what you get in the bank.
Exactly. Thank you.
You're welcome. And you buy those through, you can't buy those through a broker or anything. They're directly from the government. Any other questions for today? All right, then I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And I will, like I said, I will send out a link to the recording for the access to the slides. And then I will send out reminders for next week, but the login information will be the same throughout the workshop. So it'll be the same for all 3 weeks, the same time, same login. All right. Thank you so much for attending. I appreciate it. Everybody have a great day.